Let me set the scene for this discussion about the Metropolitan Council first. It really begins in the evolution of the Minneapolis-St. Paul area into a regional entity that occurred gradually over the years. In the beginning, there was the two legal independent cities. One of them started around the head of navigation in St. Paul. Another one 15 miles up the river where the Mississippi went over the falls, and you had the timber milling and grain milling. The cities gradually grew together at their residential edges as the annexation proceeded, but that stopped after a while. And in the 30s and 40s, municipalities began to appear around, not very large, technically known as villages, governments, around Minneapolis and around St. Paul. And a couple of things then began to drive the awareness that there was a difference between the legal city and the real city. I always thought that one of the most important ones was Major League Baseball, what Major League Baseball did. America was just only really, in many respects, becoming one country in the 1950s. And prior to that time, everything, all the baseball teams of our national support, right, were north and east of St. Louis. And Major League Baseball wanted to expand, and Twin Cities area was one of the possible sites for that. But they wanted to put one team here. And Minneapolis wanted a team, and St. Paul wanted a team, and each one had a little park. And Major League Baseball said, you know, if you want to do that, go ahead. You can, but you'll be in the minor leagues. You'll be AAA teams, you know. So we had this very interesting question. Do we want to be, respectively, the whatever it was, 27th and 43rd largest cities in America? Or do we want to be the 15th largest place, urban place in America? Do we want to be minor league or do we want to be major league? And that question in real terms was put to the Minnesota, the Twin Cities area in the 1950s. And there wasn't anybody that didn't think we wanted to be major league. We are a major league place. We've got a major league university, we've got a major league orchestra. Of course we want to be major leagues. I think that in the background had a lot of psychological effect.
Let me just offer a couple of comments going maybe a little further back. When Ted was talking about annexation, back in the late 1800s, St. Paul started expanding towards Miriam Park, and Minneapolis resented that to no end. They didn't think St. Paul had any right to be expanding in that direction. And of course, then they were really forced to come together a little bit when the transit line, of all things, did run between the two cities.
Yeah, the private streetcar line.
Yeah, the streetcar line. That was the first thing.
Well,
but then finally, one of the funniest thing, in my opinion, is that if you look at the late 1920s, in the newspaper, you'll see a schedule for an airplane to take off from Old Chamberlain and take off and land again at St. Paul Home and Field before taking off for Rochester. That we used to have intercity transportation by air. That was really
well. The big driver by the late 50s and into the 1960s was the sewerage crisis, the waste disposal crisis. Given those sandy soils, a lot of developers had been building with backyard wells, shallow wells, and with septic tanks, so that people were essentially drawing their drinking water and burying their waste in their backyard. And by the early 60s, this had surfaced, this water contamination problem, ground contamination had become a major issue that had to be dealt with. So it came to the legislature, I think, first in '59, and it didn't. There was no agreement on what to do. It came again in '61. And different parts of the area, the north suburbs, the west suburbs, the southwest suburbs, all had different ideas. They wanted to build regional plants and so forth. Nothing could get done. In 1963, it came up again, and the legislature got really irritated. And Senator Rosenmeyer said, the state will take care of it. And he passed a bill for the Commissioner of Administration to plan the thing, build the thing, and finance the thing. But that was too extreme, and that never got implemented. So they had the third session of failure, and then it came up again in 1965, and the 65 session failed. So this was becoming really urgent, and it became clear, I thought, that the legislature doesn't want to deal with local disagreements. The legislature wants a local bill situation. You figure out what you want to do and bring it to us, and if it works with state policy, we'll give you what you need. You in the county, you in the city, you got a county board, you got a city council, you figure it out. What we said to the legislature was, look, we got a regional problem here, and we don't have an institution that can do that in this area. If we had an institution that could get a representative and politically valid consensus, we could bring you that kind of thing, and we could get this problem solved and get the sewerage problem fixed. So what you need to do with the legislature is to give us that kind of a council. And I think that was essentially understood.
Do you think, Ted, that the drive to establish the Metropolitan Planning Commission was something going on separate, was related to that?
That's right. Senator Elmer Anderson, later governor, then senator, had created a Metropolitan Planning Commission in 1957. Planning was a big deal. Everybody was for planning, but it was it didn't meet the test of a politically valid body. It was what used to be called a Rube Goldberg structure of representation, a whole bunch of different things.
I guess I'd have to agree with him, because we got that. The one thing that always hit me, however, is that the impetus for the Metropolitan Planning Commission came from the municipality level. That the municipalities of the metro area, I think particularly the suburbs, more than Minneapolis. Minneapolis wasn't that excited about it, but the suburbs, and that was led by Clarence Ludwig, who wore many hats at the University of Minnesota and at the League of Minnesota Municipalities. But he got everything started as early as he came here in, I think, the 30s, and always worked for that. So we had a history of wanting to have a metropolitan approach to studying urban issues that was going on for some time.
Well, the argument that the state needed to create this, I think that was not in dispute either. The state had dealt with some of these problems earlier. Minneapolis and St. Paul had this terrible problem with the Mississippi River, where sewers running raw into the Mississippi into the 1920s. That's why all the houses are nicely set back on East River Road, West River Road. Nobody wanted to be close to the river. It smelled too bad. So they created a Minneapolis-St. Paul sanitary district in those years. It was assumed the legislature would do this, and partly because I think legislators statewide understood that Minnesota had placed almost everything in one place. It was a very unusual state in that respect. From the beginning, we put the state prison here, we put the state capitol here, we combined the state and land-grant universities and put that here. The headquarters of most all the nonprofits and business firms, banking and finance and wholesaling were here in the Twin Cities area. And the economic and social health of the Twin Cities area was a critical asset to the state. And it could not jeopardize that, because it is what made us, representing 2% of the country in Minnesota in those years, less today, a major league state, a state that counted for something, that made us different than Iowa and North Dakota and South Dakota, the states around us, and even Wisconsin. We had everything in this one place, but protecting that, making sure the economic and social health of the Twin Cities was solid and sound, was an important state interest. That, I think, in the end, helped a lot to drive the legislative action. So we had to deal with three questions. The big thing then is, could we put together in the metropolitan area, beginning after the '65 debacle, a consensus about what the Metropolitan Council ought to look like? What would we tell the legislature? The area wanted to say to the legislature, this is what we think the regional council ought to be, and not leave that to some governor's commission. So we had to put together a kind of a consensus to do that, and had to answer 3 questions. What would the representation be?
And nobody wanted the representation that was in the planning commission.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, you had
nobody-
township
the
and school
Minneapolis-
district and
Yeah, the St. Paul Sanitary District wouldn't do it either. That was 3 from Minneapolis, 3 for St. Paul, and 1 appointed by the governor from outside the area. And that wasn't going to sell.
yeah.
So we had to, it had to be rethought. The second thing then, what is this thing for? What is it going to do? What is it? Is it really here for policy purposes? Is it really here as a service delivery operation? What is it functionally? And related to that, then, depending on the decision of that, how would it be organized and how would it operate? So in the fall of '65, this question went around out to the metropolitan area. What do we want to say to the legislature next session about what the Metropolitan Council ought to look like? And the league played a part in that, but a lot of others did too. Why don't you talk a little about the who of it and the process that went on?
Sure. Well, what hit me, Ted, as I was reviewing this, I was struck again how much leadership came from a variety of organizations at the end of 1965. The legislature was ready, the Metropolitan Council was ready, the municipalities were ready, the nonprofit organizations were ready, the political parties were ready. I was just astounded in looking back to see the degree to which there was a consensus clearly developing that we need to have a new metropolitan unit. So that was exactly what, as Ted said, what that unit would do, how it would be structured. There was some variety of opinions there, although even in that regard, I don't know if you agree on this, Ted, even in that regard, there was already a widespread agreement that the representation by organizations as against people was falling behind. That is, people were beginning to sense that if this organization is going to exist, it's going to be based on representation of people, not governments. And that step helped with all the controversies we ultimately had over operating versus coordinating, that the fact that whatever we do, equal representation of people was central in the discussions from a variety of organizations.
Yeah, the League of Women Voters got actively involved in it. There was, at a late stage, the Board of Realtors was taking a position on metropolitan issues. I found an editorial in the University of Minnesota Daily, the student newspaper. It was really, in the business community, I think. Lloyd Brand at the Minneapolis Chamber was extremely important. And the University of Minnesota had created Center for Urban and Regional Affairs, and Tom Anding was its director. And Cameron Thompson, who'd earlier built up Northwest Bank Corporation, was the chair of it at the time. They played a very important role, which we'll come back to when we get to the...
I'd say another key point was whether it was a general purpose unit of government or had a defined list of what it could do and couldn't do. And it was quite clear in reading the various things that the feeling was broad that they would not be general purpose. They couldn't do everything. They could do what the legislature permitted them to do. That was, to my way of thinking, a fairly important thing. And then as Ted and I can get into great detail here, this whole question of operating versus coordinating, which became a real big issue in the session.
In the fall of '65, I'd left the Twin Cities area. I had a fellowship to go to Washington and work around, internship around Congress, which was very interesting because that year the Johnson administration would put in the Model Cities and Metropolitan Development legislation that ultimately passed in 1966. So I was able to stay in touch with the discussion in Minnesota, and a variety of legislators and others involved came to Washington for conversations. I'd meet them and talk with them there, but I was working in the Senate office for Vice President Humphrey, And so I had a chance to go around with Bob Wood, who was lobbying this for the administration and who was talking to serious legislators about the need to do this legislation. And it became obvious pretty quickly that there was pressure from the National Association of Counties and from the American Municipal Association, I guess it was called at the time, that the regional council ought to be built out of representatives from those elected levels of local government.
Which was what we didn't want to see happen.
We'd known about this so-called Council of Governments idea and had discussed it here, and had decided pretty well locally, pretty well an agreement that creating a little mini League of Nations was not really going to work. There was also, I think, a general understanding that we didn't need a metropolitan agency to figure out and take over what were essentially local functions like policing. I mean, you know, Britain eventually, or early on, created a national police force. We weren't, in France, I guess, did as well. We weren't going to do that. This was for truly area-wide questions. But the idea in the federal legislation was that there needed to be coordination. Vic Fisher worked for HHFA and the Housing and Home Finance Agency in those years. It gave me a very simple picture of the way a metropolitan urban area grows. You start by building on open land, and that grows out and out and out and out. And about 100 years later, what you build in the first place is old and obsolete and deteriorated and needs to be replaced. So you have a second ring of development that begins in the core, where you're building, you're rebuilding on land that was developed a century before. So you had to connect the core redevelopment with the suburban fringe development, and there was no agency to balance the two. And that was the driving idea behind the federal thing. The federal government was putting a lot of grant money into water and sewer and roads and parks and planning agencies, and the whole idea was to have a regional entity that would review and comment on all of the local requests for federal assistance and to make them consistent with a regional development plan that it adopted, okay? That was the concept in this federal legislation. So the representation question got to be, okay, what will that regional council look like? The local government organizations, influential as they were then in Washington and are, as influential as they were, you know, with Humphrey, wanted it to be a council of elected, what they called elected officials. We had a different view, I think, that had come out of the discussion here. An elected official, you're an elected official only if you're elected to the seat in which you're voting. You can be maybe elected to a county board or a municipal city council, but if you then go on the Metropolitan Council, you are an appointed official. You are only elected if you're elected to the seat in which you're voting. So Don Fraser was Minneapolis 5th District Minneapolis congressman at the time and was quite interested. He had been a good state senator before he went to Washington. When the bill came to the House floor, Fraser offered an amendment that simply that attached to this provision about the construction of the metropolitan planning body that said simply, except as otherwise provided by state law. That almost nothing was ever more important to what happened in the '67 session in Minnesota legislature. It opened the way for the Minnesota legislature in '67 to figure out itself what would be the right kind of metropolitan body. We then came up to the late fall of '66. I came back in, I don't know, September or something like that. The League had a committee, the Chuck Clay's committee is underway at that time. And then there was some kind of conference at St. Thomas.
Yep. the concept of holding area-wide conferences on urban affairs was something that had really gotten going in even the early 50s. That in 53 and 57 and 53, 55, 57, there were urban conferences held in the metropolitan area. And then I think in 61, if I'm not mistaken, there was another one set up maybe by the governor. So the 66 one had sort of some precedence of getting together this way.
Well, look, if we tried to say at this point how the discussion that had gone on 65 through 66 answered the three questions, if the first one was representation, I think you could say the consensus that we'd send to the legislature about that would be that it ought to be equal population districts. With respect to the method of selection, the consensus was around direct election. The suburban people believed in direct election, and you got to remember there had been a federal Supreme Court decision, Baker versus Carr, that had kind of gotten rid of the local unit representation and said they got to be equal population districts. That was on everybody's mind. So we're talking direct election. Clearly the consensus was this would be area-wide only, and that the key function certainly at this stage was to bring the legislature a consensus on the basis of which it was a policy advisor to the legislature in a real sense on metropolitan issues, replacing the Metropolitan Planning Commission, which I think it did. And so we get into the 67 legislative session and talk a little bit about the initial legislative proposals, who the authors were and what they, how that went.
It's fascinating to think about what was happening in 67 because of the, in my opinion, the great degree of action that was being called for as that session opened. It was almost as if it's not a question of whether, but what it's going to be. And so that was setting the stage for the actions on, and not most, but a lot of people really came thinking in terms of a municipality or a county. That is, a board in charge of a government had to, quote, do something. They couldn't just be the planning agency or the advisory or the consensus builder. They had to do something. So there was a strong view that the metropolitan agency, whatever it does, ought to run the transit system, ought to run the sewage system, ought to run the park system if there's going to be one, ought to, in fact, even ought to run the mosquito business and the airports business. The mosquitoes fell out of consideration quite early, and I think they're still independent today. The Airports Commission was a big deal and became quite important because of the very key role that the airports plays here, and even the Citizens League, when it ultimately came out, did not even recommend.
Yeah, nobody messes around with the MAC, is what you have to say. Yeah, we had, Paul's point is right, the area had these regional commissions, important ones for the Sanitary District, the Airports Commission, and a Transit Commission had been formed by voluntary action, joint powers among a number of municipalities, so the transit thing existed. And one of the ideas around the legislature in this thinking period was that setting up the special districts were enough. Saul Adams from Wayzata, House member, was of that opinion. We don't really need a metropolitan council. And I remember we had some discussion about this. Look, I look out the window at an office building. And you have an owner and a general contractor and an architect, but they don't build the thing. You know, you have a plumbing system and a heating system and a ventilation system and an internal transportation system, and all of these things are done by subcontractors. But you wouldn't try to construct one of the office building without a general contractor and an architect. You know, and I think that made basic sense to people, and the special district only notion sort of faded off the scene.
But its existence, not its independence, was.
Yeah, that was the idea, that you didn't need to abolish their existence. All you needed to abolish was their independence. You couldn't have each of the subcontractors doing its own ideal plumbing system, heating system. Gordon Rosenmeyer was a veteran senator from Little Falls, a lawyer up there, a bachelor, and generally regarded as the most powerful person in the legislature, with good reason. I don't know if were you with me that we went to got to meet him and get acquainted. And
I was there. Yes, Ted's talking about a session we had at the Minneapolis Club one afternoon.
Well, yeah, people said you got to meet Rosenmeyer, and so I got a hold of him, and he said, well, meet me over there, and he was famous for his scotch and waters or scotch and sodas. I never knew for sure which. And I nursed a brandy for a couple hours, and he explained things, and he said Minnesota's a great state, much bigger than its size would suggest. The heart of Minnesota is its government, and they go on to explain. I condense here. And in the heart of its government is the Senate, is the legislature. That's the heart of the government here. And the heart of the legislature is the Senate. He explained all that. And then he said the heart of the Senate is the Committee on Civil Administration, because it deals with all of the governmental structure within the state. And state and local. And Rosenmeyer chaired all the key committees and subcommittees. He chaired the subcommittee on state departments of civil administration, which meant he controlled everything the governor wanted. He chaired the Judiciary Committee, which meant he controlled everything the courts and the lawyers wanted. He controlled the Committee on Appropriations. He chaired a Committee on Appropriations, which acted on, which controlled everything.
Didn't Sinclair chair that?
He chaired the General Finance Committee.
Yeah.
Yeah,
okay.
sure. And he had his acolytes chairing committees that he didn't chair personally.
And his Committee on Committees, wasn't that?
He chaired the Committee on Committees, which meant he controlled everything the legislators wanted. All right. So there's no question about Gordon Rosenmeyer's influence. And coming into this period, the House and the Senate each had set up, in anticipation of the consensus coming in from the Twin Cities community in '67, had set up subcommittees of civil administration. Today this is the committee known as Government Operations, but civil administration was their term at the time. He'd set it up, they'd set up subcommittees on metropolitan affairs, and Gordon predictably chaired the one in the Senate about that. And I think the turning point was a day in a House committee when Tom Anding at the Upper Midwest Council had brought in key people from the business community. There was Phil Nason, who was president of the Federal Reserve, not the Federal Reserve, the First National Bank of St. Paul. Earl Ewald, who was the CEO at what was then Northern States Power Company, and I think Donald Dayton, who was the senior member of the family that had the Dayton stores. And they didn't testify at all. They just sat there watching this and listening to this all morning long. And it wasn't more than about 24 hours after that a bill appeared from Gordon Rosenmeyer, who had a kind of a personal staff member working for him, Bob Edmond, with an alternate proposal that accepted the basic system of representation, but provided, instead of election, for appointment by the governor. So in the late stages of the '67 session, this became very largely an argument about whether we're creating here a state agency or a local agency. The election defining the local, and the governor appointment defining the state agency.
The Rosenmeyer bill was sitting here. The more conventional Metro Council thing was the Ogdal-Frenzel proposal? Would you say those two were the,
Sure,
were
those
the,
were-
were
yeah.
the two things?
Yeah,
And I think Ted and I are a little bit vague right now as to exactly. I thought my memory is that the Ogdal-Prenzel proposal was for operating. That is, you would not have the appointment of the districts. You would be it would be set up running them directly.
they were only going to, in '67, all they were going to do was going to create the council, and it would then come in with proposals about what it ought to be and do.
Let me just interject here. The Citizens League, in some respects, one could have thought was simply another player among 25 different ones, and it was not the most important one, and we'll never know what role they did play. But the Citizens League proposal ended up being, I think, a very significant one in developing the consensus that the legislature took on. And the League itself had conflicts over operating versus coordinating. It had very persuasive members who wanted to have the organization run the transit system, run the airport submission, and run the sewer system and all those directly. And there were others who favored the coordinating approach. They ended up with a recommendation that did support direct operations, but giving the council the power, if it wanted to have boards over those organizations. So it in effect was a operating one that the operation with the option to be coordinated.
Kind of a wishy-washy compromise.
I think that's a wishy-washy compromise.
I was not a part of it, but
and I think my memory is that Art Naftalin was probably the deciding factor on that decision.
Art by this time was mayor of Minneapolis, but he had been earlier the state commissioner of administration in Freeman's time as governor. But
Doug Kelm was also big in that.
well, we get to you come down to the end, and things happen very rapidly at the end of the session. I remember I was writing editorials pretty frequently saying, you know, they won't end without doing something. There will be a decision. It just comes, you know, legislature makes a lot of its big decisions in the very late stages. Bob Renner got into it. He was a House member from Walker who was chairing the Civil Administration Committee that year, and reflected the rural Minnesota. He said to me at one point, you know, the legislature is going to have to do this because you people down there can never agree, which goes back to this question, give us a mechanism within which we can agree. He ended up at the end saying, pass both bills, pass the Rosenmeyer bill, let the governor choose. Harold Levander was governor, and he had been on record reflecting the position of the Republican Party. Party had platforms in those days, which supported a local Metropolitan Council as an essentially local agency, and Harold had supported that. Bill Frenzel offered to compromise at the end, which carried both the local concept of a local council with equal population districts, representation in the sense of equal population districts, but with the members to be selected by the governor through appointment. And this is what came to the floor. In both the House, in the House, Martin Sabo made a floor motion to substitute a provision for election, and in the Senate, Wendell Anderson later governor, offered the motion for election, and in both bodies, that was a really tense moment. We watched the board going green and red. I think it failed in each house by not more than 1 or 2 votes. A shift of 1 or 2 votes would have been the difference. I watched the guy from Albert Lee. I remember he initially came on supporting the motion with a green button, supporting election, and then he saw the Speaker of the House looking at the board, and the Speaker of the House was with Rosenmeyer, and so the guy went red, and then by God he went green again. But the election failed, and so the Metropolitan Council was set to go, and it just needed to be set up then. And Harold Evander was governor. Dave Durnberger was his executive secretary at the time.
What I remember about this was the drama, particularly on the role of the chair, who the chair was going to be, because the chair was going to be designated by the governor. That was another interesting thing, was that they didn't have the council be
Didn't elect its own chair.
The governor was going to name it.
It was a separate
So it became the focus of who's going to be that, and it was a separate office, that's right. And so everybody was wondering what was going on, and I don't know if I have some knowledge of an action that took place. I'll tell it and see if Ted overrules me and says it's wrong. But in the Citizens League Board of Directors one day, we were talking about who's going to be the chair of the Metro Council, and there was some wondering about who would have it, and the word came out that that the person who was going to be elected or be selected as chair was already serving on one of the commissions.
Durnberger had said, we're going to have a really good chairman. We got a really good person in mind. And so immediately I thought to myself, well, it has to be Clayton Lefevre, who was a city attorney for Richfield and a strong Metro supporter. And I went to see Clayton, and he said, no, it's not me. And well, who then could it be? Well, Durnberger had said the person had served on both the MAC and the I don't know what the sanitary district, I think it's or the Metropolitan Planning Commission or whatever. And so I looked through all the rosters, and there one guy came up. He was a St. Paul lawyer that none of us basically had really ever heard of. But
well, it was Joe Maughan.
Yeah, it was Joe.
And Joe Maughan, Betty Wilson, the very good reporter for the Minneapolis paper.
No, St. Paul.
St.
For
Paul.
the suburban papers.
Suburban papers. She had written an article speculating it was going to be Joe Maughan. And Ted came to the Citizens League board meeting and was sharing some of this. And I'll always remember when Ted said, as far as we can tell, it appears it's going to be Joe Maughan. And Peter Gillette, I think, is Peter still around today?
Yeah, I think so.
Can you take one expletive? Okay, who the hell is Joe Maughan? And I remember just bursting out laughing when I heard him say that. And so that then led to some behind-the-scenes movement to get Jim Hetland.
Well, Vern, let me say, Vern very skillfully, the executive director of the league, he didn't get into the question of personalities. He had the league issue a statement recommending criteria for the selection of the Metro Council chairman. And the criteria, of course, high up on the list of criteria was a record of demonstrated support for a regional agency over the years. And it was perfectly clear that the name that we heard the governor had in mind did not fit the criteria. And I've always thought that inside the governor's office, Durnberger said to the governor, we can't do this. We've got to be with the regional consensus. And so they went to Hetland. Jim Hetland, been a law school professor, been active in the Republican Party,
wrote the platform, by the way.
Wrote the platform
on
and so forth. So Hetland was appointed, and they had the first meeting. The representation at that time was by Senate districts combined by twos. That was what part of the Frenzel final version. Senate districts combined by twos. So there were 6 on the east and 5 on the, how many? Whatever.
Oh gosh.
However many. An equal number on the East Metro and the West Metro. And Hetland was the deciding vote. Living in Minneapolis, he voted for St. Paul. That's why you office in St. Paul today. And that gesture of cooperation, between the cities, not being parochial about it, kind of set the tone. Bob Jorvig who'd been the Minneapolis city coordinator, was hired to be the principal staff for the new council, and it was in business, and it went off to start planning the proposal for the regional sewer system that it would bring to the legislature in '69.
So I think as we're talking here, you kind of think of names of people that are being mentioned prominently and those that aren't. Ted just mentioned briefly Vern, and Vern is Vern Johnson. He's now deceased. Vern was the executive director of the Citizens League from 1958 to 1967, and later became director of planning at General Mills. But Vern, I'd have to say, based on my thinking, is probably is one of the most, if not the most significant individual outside the legislature in getting the council.
He'd been a
set.
legislator briefly.
Yeah, he had. Right.
Been a House member for a term, and he had been assistant to a congressman in Washington and had come back here. But he quickly, the Citizens League's function at the beginning, '58, was Minneapolis city government charter reform. And he quickly took the league up from left that aside after the failure in 1960, and went in and was decisive in the reorganization of Hennepin County. I mean, up to the 1960 census, Hennepin County had 4 members from Minneapolis and 1 from rural Hennepin, despite the fact that the population was almost equal, suburban and central city. And then Vern took the league quickly, and you could see that the real cutting-edge issues were those that surrounded the Metropolitan question. Well, anyway, we then, I'd come to the league in the summer of '67 when Vern went to General Mills, and so I inherited this situation. Paul and I worked on this, and we knew we had to deal with the question of in '69 with the issues unsettled, questions unanswered in '67. In '69 we had to deal with the ones not settled in '67, one of which was we didn't go back to the election question. I figured that was set. The council came in with a sewer plan for what we have, the interceptors, and 1 downstream plant. Nothing discharging into Lake Minnetonka, as had earlier been proposed. Nothing upstream close to the Minneapolis water intakes, which the North Suburban people had proposed. Big interceptor system running to the expanded, improved Pig's Eye plant. The council proposed that it build and run the regional system. The legislature in '69 did not accept that. The legislature instead created the Waste Control Commission as a metropolitan agency. Somewhere along the line, I think the Transit Commission was also made statutory.
With the council appointing the members.
Yeah, David Graven, who an interesting guy, active with the league and also a professor of law at the university and on the Metro Council, talked about the 3 golden threads. The council would name the members of the subordinate commissions. It would control their finances, and it would give them their system plans. That would tell them essentially what was important for them to do. The effort was to concentrate the regional commission's attention on the key system, regional questions, major questions of regional importance, not to fuss around with the minor details. The 3 golden threads, this was the concept of the council's relationship with the subordinate commissions. The league had, in a committee chaired by Greer Lockhart, had rethought this question as well and supported this idea. In a sense, it was a choice between the way local government, counties and municipalities are organized and the way the state and national governments are organized. The state level, you don't have, you have a separation of powers. You have a legislative body, you have an executive body that's responsible for administration and operation, and you have a policy control over the administration. And so that, in a way, this was the central question. Are we creating a local agency or a state agency here? And the answer was perfectly reflected in an opinion from the Attorney General at that point. 'Cause the council needed to know a number of things, and the Attorney General's opinion said, no, you don't have to use the state treasurer. No, you don't have to use the Attorney General as your lawyer. I can almost remember the language. It said it's neither a purely state agency nor a purely local agency, but an entity lying intermediate between the two and possessing some of the characteristics of each, all right? And that was the basis on which the council got set up. The Star and Tribune had an airplane, a DC-3 at the time, and I got them to make it available to take the new members of the Metropolitan Council plus a number of reporters. I remember Betty Wilson and some others, and do a fly around the area to get a look at what at this real city that you're going to be in charge of governing, which was, I think, a really useful thing to do.